A deadly meningitis outbreak has called into question the efficacy of government oversight of a practice called drug compounding. Could more government regulation have prevented over a dozen deaths? I'm Bill Whittle, filling in for Alan Barton, and you're watching Front Page. Well, joining me in studio to discuss this subject are Rituparna Basu of the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights and Terry Jones of Investors Business Daily. Welcome, guys. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
Well, as of this taping, there have been approximately 169 people stricken by fungal meningitis after receiving spinal injections of a steroid produced by the New England Compounding Center. The outbreak has called into question the safety of pharmacies that sell what are known as compounded drugs, which are batches of drugs mixed up by the pharmacies themselves, as opposed to drugs directly from drug companies that are strictly regulated by the FDA. So you could make the case that this is a way to sort of circumvent FDA regulations. Terry, before we actually delve into these questions of regulation, do you see any benefit of compounded drugs, first of all? Because obviously if we're going to weigh risk and reward, we got to understand what the reward is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge benefit to compounded drugs. One is that physicians have the flexibility of giving somebody exactly what they need. For instance, if you have something like this cortisone treatment that caused all these difficulties, and you have a painkiller in with it, or an anti-inflammatory agent that helps it work, some people might be allergic to one and not to another. So a compounder can go in and make the drug that that person needs. So it's very beneficial to have compounding. It's not something that's, that's squirrely or not legitimate. It's a very legitimate use of pharmacies.
Well, Ritu, up until very recently, this compounding issue has been a pretty small potatoes kind of thing, pretty much individual pharmacists putting together their own mixtures and so on. But now this industry is apparently growing so large that you could make the case that they're morphing into drug manufacturers, that this is becoming large enough scale so that it becomes a societal issue. Now, anytime something gets big enough for the government to pay attention to, the government immediately wants to put some regulations on things because that's what they do. Do you think that these regulations would be helpful, or do you think that they're going to cause more harm than good by taking away a procedure that Terry just said has got actual benefits?
Well, I think you pointed it out that the issue is that they've gotten pretty big. So usually when a company gets big, that's usually a good thing. It means they're providing a product that people clearly want. What's the problem? They should be congratulated if they're doing it honestly. Now, in this particular case, there was clearly negligence going on. But the vast majority of compounding pharmacies, they deliver very good products, and 10% of the drugs administered in the United States today come from these sorts of pharmacies. So certainly we should not demonize them for being big. So what really irks the regulators is, yes, they are producing these drugs without government permission, without the FDA's permission, and that's what they want. They want that control. Now, is that control going to make things better? Well, the real issue, I think, it's not going to make things better. FDA has not prevented any particular, dangerous drugs from coming to the market. Vioxx, FDA approved. It's Merck that figured out, hey, maybe there's something more going on here. They're the ones who pulled it off the market. There's no evidence that the FDA can do a good job, and particularly because the free market, private companies have a profit motive. They cannot make money by killing their customers, by doing things that hurt their reputation. This company that produced this contaminated compound, they're out of business. They're never going to do this kind of business again. Their reputation is shot. The FDA does not have those incentives. And indeed, the FDA has the incentive to avoid blame. So the FDA approves something, then later seen to be a problem, who gets blamed? The FDA. So what do? They delay approvals. They stop drugs and devices from coming to the market so that they don't get blamed afterwards. That's their incentive. That's the wrong incentive. The market has the right incentives.
That's something that's a profound point, Terry. I want to go to that for a second, because this idea that the FDA does nothing but protect us by holding up drug approvals, 20 years in many cases, 20 years of delays before the FAA will approve a drug. And everybody says, oh, swell, they're watching out for us. What we never talk about is how many people died during those 20 years who, if we had treated them as adults and apprised them of the risk and said that this drug was still in the testing stages, many people might have survived. Yeah. This argument, I think, has always been used to bludgeon us into more and more regulations, right? Well, we could have saved these 10 people or 12 people or so on.
Well, it's really, basically it's an argument that the government should be able to do whatever it wants with drugs and delay them indefinitely from coming onto the market. It used to be, when the FDA was first created, it only had to determine that a drug was safe. That was the only criterion it used.
Not harmful in the degree of like thalidomide or something that's going to cause you birth defects or whatever.
That's right. So just safe for use.
So the FDA did not catch that either.
Yeah.
The FDA was all ready to pass thalidomide. They had no idea.
Yeah, but I mean that was at least a limit on the scope of what they did. They added later this notion that they had to find that drugs were safe and efficacious. That is, that they would actually work. That opened the door for them to require 10, 20 years of testing. You talk to the pharmaceutical manufacturers today, they say it costs $1 billion to develop a drug.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. And the reason being, it takes 5 to 7 years at the minimum just to get it out of the laboratory and into testing. And it's a very expensive process, and we're slowing it down, making it harder. This used to be probably the most innovative industry in America. It's not quite the innovator that it used to be, and others are starting to catch up with us.
Well, this is what happens when you treat people like children, right? Where you are unwilling to say to them, as an adult, here are what we perceive the risks to be, here's what we perceive the rewards to be. We're going to let you make a decision over your own life and your own treatment. When we take that out of the mix, things generally get worse. In 2003, an expert in pharmacy compounding spoke out against lax standards in the industry. I'm going to play an excerpt of her testimony now.
Last year, the CDC warned physicians and health systems to consider substandard compounded drug exposures in cases of unexplained infections following intraspinal injections after an outbreak of fungal meningitis was associated with compounded products. CDC further warned that health systems may not even realize that they are purchasing compounded drugs.
Well, the argument we just made, Terry, both of us, all three of us have made the sort of the free will adult being apprised of the risk argument is dependent on understanding what the risk is and being apprised of it. So one of the complaints that you often hear is that doctors themselves are unaware that they're prescribing compounded drugs, and so therefore they're not able to make a rational decision on their own part for the treatment, nor make a rational appraisement to their patients of what the risks are. Do you think that's a serious point to consider?
I think it's a very serious point, and it brings up, one of the key elements of any free market is that you have to have a free flow of information. People need to know what they're buying before they buy it, so they can't be defrauded. And in this case, that would go double for doctors, because if a doctor is prescribing a medicine and he doesn't know how it's made or whether it's safe, he in essence becomes sort of a accessory after the fact to somebody's murder or sickness.
But I do think I think this is kind of an overblown kind of thing. If there's demand on the market for information about these drugs, obviously producers would supply this information. Just like the government does not have to tell people or tell companies that you have to give information about what's in, all the specs of a computer. People want that information. Obviously, the producer is going to give that information. That's what people. Otherwise, no one's going to buy the product. I think, if you look at the history of the FDA, how it has expanded its regulatory powers. We talked about thalidomide. Thalidomide was shown to cause fetal deformities. The FDA had no idea of this. They were ready to pass the drug. And in Europe, when that scare broke out, that's when they said, oh, we're going to pull this drug off the market. That they had no indication that was going to happen. But it caused a scare. People were afraid. They wanted FDA to expand its controls. And what we got was the efficacy requirement that drugs have to be effective. Well, what is thalidomide causing fetal deformities, potentially being unsafe, have to do with effectiveness? It has nothing to do with effectiveness, but it's an excuse to expand the powers. And this is precisely what this is. We've got one pharmacy who produced something that is contaminated, who is being negligent, and because of that, that is being used as an excuse to take over that entire industry. And people have to see that this is not an innocent sort of move. And that's why you say, well, doctors don't really know, and there's not really information that's flowing, and apparently the FDA can provide this information. No, this is an excuse to take over these really productive industries.
Let me just close with a quick oversight of this, because I think, we've got a philosophical issue here. Certainly, I read Don and Yaron's book on free market revolution, and the argument that they were making, and you're a member of the Ayn Rand Institute, the argument that they're making is that it is irrational to assume that the government is going to look out for somebody's interests when the company itself has its own self-interest to be looking out for, that the company itself and that the market basically rewards people that play fair and produce safe and usable drugs. What would you say to somebody who said that we need more regulation, we need a paper trail, we need more limitations on these things? Can you make that case that the market and that the individual companies are better able to police this kind of abuse?
What people need to understand about the FDA is that when FDA is regulating the production of a drug before it's even on the market, so it's preventative law, you're assuming someone's guilty before having any reason to think that they're guilty. So all drug manufacturers are assumed guilty until they prove that they're not trying to defraud their patients, they're not trying to kill their patients or anything like that. When you have a system like that, the incentives are all messed up. So the FDA is not, like I said earlier, it's not trying to make drugs particularly any safer. Indeed, what it's trying to do, and even this whole issue of safety or effectiveness, so what's safe for you may not particularly be safe for me. We know this. Medicine is individualized, it should be personalized, and it's something like Vioxx. Vioxx did a lot of good things for a lot of people. It also did some bad things for some people, but that's a judgment sometimes that you have to make. Here are the risks, here are the benefits. I have to make that judgment whether I want to take this drug. We saw this with the beta blockers in the 1970s that reduce risk of secondary heart attack. People knew this was an effective drug, but what was the FDA concerned about? Well, maybe this causes cancer 30 years down the road. Well, if I am afraid of getting a secondary heart attack, I might decide, okay, I want to take this drug, and maybe I will get cancer in 30 years, but you know what? It's worth it if I live these 30 years. And what happened in the process? At least 100,000 people died waiting for this drug to hit the market because the FDA was shuffling its feet.
Terry, I'll give you the last word very quickly because we're about out of time, but you can take this regulation argument. We could have saved these people and apply it, and not only can apply it, but have applied it to every sector of the economy. Is this country fundamentally overregulated? And if so, by how much?
It is fundamentally overregulated, and if you look at the cost estimates for the regulation, it's massive. It's, the one I've seen most recently is $1.8 trillion a year. No one can convince me, and I've not seen any studies to suggest that that $1.8 trillion is worth the benefit we get from it. It's a cost. It's an enormous cost. And the benefit we get from it is far less than that cost. And it has to be reduced across the board through regulatory reform of some sort, rolling back regulations in certain industries entirely. But certainly, radical regulatory reform has been called for.
I think this is one of the problems with too many regulations. When you have a cancer warning sign every single place you go in California, it tends to make you ignore all of them. That's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. Thanks very much for being here. For Terry and Rituparna, I'm Bill Whittle. You've been watching Front Page.